I call the Environment and Natural Resources Finance and Policy Committee to order. I see a quorum is present. We're going to start with the minutes. Could I have a motion to approve the minutes from February 11th, 2025? Representative Gilman? Oh, Representative Burkle, would you move those minutes?
Yep, I've reviewed the minutes. I'll move the minutes today.
We have a motion. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Minutes are approved. Similarly to last time, members, we have a very full agenda today. I just wanted to lead with that, and it may be that there's lots of discussion, and if that is the case, I didn't want anybody to feel like we couldn't have a longer conversation if necessary. So I do have the room reserved. We could come back at 4. The room would be 120, not this particular room, but 120. Just wanted to mention that right out of the gate. Members, we're going to start with the Minnesota Chamber and Chamber Foundation. They're here today to give us an overview and report that they released last year on Minnesota's environmental permitting process. Mr. O'Neill, you're at the table. Welcome to the committee. And I think we're set to go, so I would encourage you to introduce yourself for the record and proceed with your presentation.
All right, thank you so much, Chair Heintzeman and members of this committee, for the opportunity to share findings from our research on Minnesota's environmental permitting system. I'm Sean O'Neill. I serve as the Director of Economic Development and Research for the Minnesota Chamber Foundation. And before I get into findings of the report, I just want to provide a brief background on the Chamber Foundation and describe some of the economic context that led us to this research. The Minnesota Chamber Foundation's primary focus is on conducting economic research on the performance of the state's economy. And while aligned with the Chamber, we're independently funded and governed separate from the Chamber. We consult with a wide variety of stakeholders and experts as we conduct this research and develop reports. The Minnesota Chamber Foundation has conducted research over the past several years, examining opportunities to further grow and expand the state's economy this decade and beyond. And a lot of that research highlights that Minnesota already has a very strong and diverse industry base. We have competitive advantages in areas like manufacturing, food and agriculture, natural resource related sectors like mining, energy, clean tech, as well as healthcare and life sciences. All of these sectors are very important to our economy today, but they also represent opportunities for growth and further development into the future. There's also emerging trends in the national economy that present new opportunities for states like Minnesota. So what we've seen since 2022 is a significant increase in investments in the manufacturing sector in the U.S. economy. So construction spending in the U.S. manufacturing sector spiked by 70% in 2023. It increased by a similar percentage the year before that and continued to remain very elevated throughout last year. And what we see happening across the country is very large-scale investments being made in new facilities and expansions in things like semiconductors, clean energy, biomanufacturing, a lot of different industries that are seeing very significant investments. Now, to be sure, some of this activity is occurring in Minnesota. However, data from sources like Site Selection magazine shows that Minnesota is lagging behind other states in the region in terms of total new and expansion projects. And further, company headquarters that are headquartered here are investing more in other states than companies that are headquartered outside of the state are investing into Minnesota. So we think we're not fully capitalizing on the opportunity to capture some of that investment. Also within our core economic statistics, there's some areas for concern in sectors that are most closely tied to our permitting process here. Since the pre-pandemic peak, Minnesota's real GDP output contracted in sectors like manufacturing, construction, mining, utilities, all of which ranked in the bottom half of states in these important industries. Now, one way to improve the performance of these sectors is to reduce barriers for companies that already want to invest and expand here in the state. And that can reduce the time, cost, and uncertainty that companies have as they are thinking about where they'll place investments to add jobs, add new production lines, and so forth. Those are some of the factors that businesses and site selectors account for when planning these investments. And are factors that have led to some notable economic development projects that have left the state in recent years or have failed to complete projects here. Now, importantly, our report only examines opportunities to improve the efficiency and certainty of our permitting process here, not to lower standards in Minnesota's permitting programs. The state's environmental regulations are designed to both protect the environment and human health while also enabling economic development to take place through a timely and predictable process. So we think that this is really a both and issue. However, while there's broad agreement on these principles, it's harder to discern sometimes in practice how Minnesota is achieving these objectives. And that's what spurred this research from the Minnesota Chamber Foundation. We wanted to produce an objective analysis that answers some fundamental questions about the efficiency and transparency of our permitting system here. The Chamber Foundation partnered with Bar Engineering, who was the lead researcher on this project. They had sub-partners on the project as well, the Policy Navigation Group and Squire Patton Boggs. And together they provided an in-depth study of this issue. There's a full technical report that can be found on the Chamber Foundation's website. There's also a summary report as well that goes through some of the key findings. So with that background, I'll get into the main findings of this research. And as I'm doing this, I just want to highlight some terms that I'll be using. The Minnesota Pollution Control Agency has different categories to designate different kinds of environmental permits. These permits are broken into two different tiers, with Tier 1 representing more routine permits that don't require individualized action for the facility. They don't have public comment periods. Tier 2 permits are written for the individual facility. They do have public comment periods, and there's a different goal for how long it takes to issue permits based on those tiers. The MPCA also prioritizes permit applications based on whether that permit's needed for construction to take place at the facility. So this is a way to ensure greater priority for those projects that relate most closely to economic development and job creation activities. So getting into the findings, the report found a substantial difference in typical review times between Tier 1 and Tier 2 permits. For example, most companies are issued a Tier 1 air permit in around a month. The median was just 29 days. And this is an area of the state's permitting process that has proven consistently effective and efficient for companies. However, when a company needs one of the various Tier 2 air permits, that's where we see much longer timelines associated with those. The median time here to issue a Tier 2 air permit ranged from 419 days to 771 days, in that 6-year range between 2018 and 2023. Breaking down the data a little further to look at just those priority Tier 2 air permits. So these are now ones where the permit's needed for construction activity to take place. We found that between 5 to 17% of priority Tier 2 air permits were issued within the state's 150-day goal over the past 5 years. The range of issuance timelines varies significantly as well. Some priority Tier 2 permits were issued in as few as 29 days, but others took much longer, and the median time frame was 351 days. The average was 586. Again, this is for priority Tier 2 air permits. As we would expect, non-priority air permits that don't involve construction at the facility experience longer timelines than that. As the chart here shows, the median time frame to issue a non-priority Tier 2 air permit was 887 days, and the average was close to 1,300 days. In many cases, this doesn't pose a significant issue for the business. They can continue operating while a permit is going through a renewal process. However, it can become problematic if a company is looking to make a capital investment and they have a permit renewal or minor modification that's been out there for a long time, and there's some uncertainty around that permit if they were to try to move forward a capital investment project. Now, the Policy Navigation Group, one of the research firms involved in the study, wanted to look at how Minnesota compares to peer states in issuing federal air permits. So these are federal air permits that have the same standards regardless of where that project is located. The only difference is in how the different states would issue the permit at the state level. This analysis focuses on similar industries and projects to try to capture as close to an apples-to-apples comparison as they could. And their analysis found that the average timeframes to issue these air permits took 1.5 to 6 times longer in Minnesota than in other peer states that they evaluated. States on the low end, like Iowa and Illinois, averaged around 110 days to issue these federal air permits for capital investment projects. States on the higher end, like North Carolina and Colorado, were over 400 days. But again, Minnesota's timeframes were considerably higher, averaging 656 days over this 5-year sample period. Now, these permitting differences are estimated to have an impact on the state's economy. So when a business has to delay construction of a capital investment project, it means fewer days where they can be operating, adding jobs, spending into the local supply chain, adding to tax revenues. And when these missed days of operation are multiplied over time and across facilities, it can add up to real economic impact for the state. Policy Navigation Group estimated that Minnesota could gain anywhere from $260 million to $910 million in additional annual output and create an additional 960 to 3,400 full-time equivalent jobs annually if our permitting timelines were more similar to these peer states. Now, Bar Engineering also looked at timelines for the state's water permitting programs. And here the finding was similar to what we saw with air permitting in terms of timeframes for industrial Tier 2 water permits. But what was different is that these industrial Tier 2 water permits are requested less frequently than the Tier 2 air permits. Since 2018, the agency received only 15 priority applications of this kind, but of those 15, 3 of them met the 150-day goal, and the average issuance timeframe was between 377 days for a major modification and 476 days for a new permit issuance. Also similar to what we saw with air permitting, the state's Tier 1 water permits are typically issued very quickly, with companies usually waiting just days to get something like a construction stormwater permit. So clearly there are areas both of strengths and challenges with these programs that should be considered. The researchers also found that Minnesota has a higher average number of administratively continued water permits compared to other peer states. As of the third quarter of 2023, there were 152 administratively continued permits in Minnesota, and those permits had been extended beyond the permit term for an average of 6.6 years, which is nearly twice as long as the average for other states. Further, Minnesota issues fewer individual industrial water permits than other states, so there's less permits being issued. Over a 5-year period, Minnesota issued 75 permits compared to 214 in the peer states that they looked at. So shifting into the report's recommendations, the research compiled by our partners led us to 3 key areas that we think should be prioritized for improvement. One is to reduce the time that it takes to issue Tier 2 air and water permits and to bring review times closer to the state's 150-day goal that they have. Again, there are areas of the state's permitting system that do move quite fast and efficiently, but there are others where delays are more commonly experienced. And focusing efforts on reducing timelines associated with especially priority Tier 2 air and water permits could have a beneficial impact to our economy by allowing more certainty for companies and allowing them to get through the permitting process faster so that they can start construction earlier for an expansion or a new facility here. The second priority area was to address the backlog of permit renewals and minor facility modifications. We think this would improve overall system efficiency and reduce some uncertainty for companies that might have an administratively continued permit and could be hesitant to move forward with a capital investment improvement or expansion given that permit that's in limbo. And then lastly, a really critical goal is to increase transparency and collaboration with companies as they go through what can often be a quite complex process. We identified a number of ways to do this across the state's programs in air, water, as well as wetlands and environmental review, so that companies can better predict and plan as they look to build or expand a facility here. The full report includes over 30 specific considerations for improvement that could help achieve these aims. I can't cover all those recommendations here today, but I'll provide just a couple examples to illustrate some of the ways that Minnesota could streamline these programs, again, without reducing environmental standards. A couple areas to highlight in air permitting. One idea is to consider creating a separate construction and operating permit program the way many other states do. There might be some trade-offs to consider here, but there is some evidence to suggest that separating these permit programs, rather than combining them into one, as Minnesota currently does, could be more efficient and help accelerate project timelines for construction activity. Another suggestion in the report is to enhance the state's expedited permitting program, which is supposed to be a tool that businesses can pay into to fast-track time-sensitive projects. Minnesota does currently have this program, but it's not clear how often it's available to companies, and we didn't have a way to kind of track data around this because the agency doesn't designate who is using this expedited process. Our report suggests some alternative ways to structure this program and make it more widely available to companies and leverage external capacity to improve timeline outcomes. So moving on to water permitting, a couple suggestions that were in the report was one to provide a schedule to the applicant at the front end of a project that documents the various steps of the permitting process and the expected timelines for those steps. And this could be very helpful for both air and water programs. We interviewed companies and consultants to kind of ask about their experience, and they said that when they did receive a schedule like that, it was very helpful for them to plan in advance, be able to kind of plan out their construction timelines, their overall project, plan the capital around that. But that kind of schedule isn't always available to companies. Another idea was to develop additional general permits for facilities that have similar kinds of operations and types of discharges. This could potentially leverage the strength of Minnesota's Tier 1 programs and create a more standardized and streamlined process in cases where that's appropriate. And then lastly, I'll just mention that the report does assess Minnesota's environmental review and wetlands programs and provides some recommendations on each. In both of these areas, it was difficult to measure efficiency because there's a lack of available data on timeline outcomes. But our research partners did identify some changes that could eliminate redundancies, streamline the application process, and improve tracking and reporting of outcomes. So I will conclude there, but happy to take questions from the committee.
Thank you, Mr. O'Neill. Members, any questions? Representative Falconer.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think just my first question, maybe you have some follow-up. Would this bill allow for the expediting of mining permits? Taconite, non-ferrous, other?
Mr. O'Neill.
Thanks for the question. I'm not able to speak to the details of the bill that's being considered. My knowledge is more around the report that we conducted through the Chamber Foundation, so I've let others address the bill itself.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'll save it for then.
Representative Falconer, did you have an additional comment?
Sorry, Chair. No, I'll save that for later.
Lead Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have some questions on the report here. Oops. Thank you. Thank you, Chair Heintzeman. I do appreciate the opportunity to have some questions here for our testifier. I know that over the years, we've done a lot to try to address what's happening with the efficiencies and getting permits out on time. That's something that we've done. We've passed things in the past. I know that for 2023, in the most recent report that came out, that in Tier 2 permits, that 98% of them got out on time. The question is that I don't feel this report really gets to is what are the specific areas that we're having troubles with? In other words, trying to figure out what are the root causes of some of the problems out there, and also taking the data that's in there. And the reason I'm raising the question here is when I take a look at, these would probably be on slides 13 and 14, where we're saying that some of the permits are taking up to, on slide 13, 3,400 days, on the other one up to 6,500 days. When we're taking a look at these permits going through, how much of this, and also on some of the other ones where we're highlighting length of time in there, it feels like everything's lumped together here. What I'm wondering is, there are some times where I know construction permits have been, or permits are being looked at and they go to the appeals process. Now, when they go to the courts, there's nothing that we can do from our side to shorten that up. It feels like these are included in here. I also know that some of the continuing permits out there, the reason that they're taking so long is because they're continuing to violate the original permits. And so it's hard for me to get a real good idea what's going on when these kind of things are into the gross numbers here. Do you have the details broken out as to taking some of those components out so we would know what the other numbers are for things that we really can't control, to be able to take a look, where are the instances? How often is it because the department didn't have the right qualified staff on hand? Is it a staffing issue? And with the report you have here, you've got a lot of gross numbers that really doesn't give me that level of detail. Can you provide more granular detail so as we're addressing this, we're making sure we're getting to the right roots of the problem?
Mr. O'Neill, and I would just mention there's a lot there, Lead Fisher. So if there is follow-up that we need later on after committee, we understand. But if you could address those questions today, that'd be great.
Sure.
Mr. O'Neill.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Representative, for the question. In the report, we really did try to break down the data on timelines in a pretty granular way. So again, I think this was maybe the chart you were referencing, but we were looking at priority tier, by priority and by tier and across medium. So we're trying to break it down in that sense. And trying to represent it in a statistically fair way too. So we're not just looking at the average, because the average could really influence the total aggregate number, but looking at, again, the minimum, the median, the average, and the maximum to try to get a sense of the full picture of overall timelines for those permit categories. Your questions about some of the root causes of delay is a fair question. And it's beyond the scope of our research to be able to look at the experience with each individual permit, because there's going to be variation in the circumstances around any given permit application. What the researchers were trying to do is look at the way Minnesota's permitting processes are designed and structured to see if there's anything different from the way other states operate similar kinds of programs that might influence the efficiency and timeliness of those programs. And so the recommendations that are in the report really address the structure of those programs, because there's going to be information that we're just not able to access on each individual permit application. I believe that the agency, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, does look at some different factors when they issue their annual permit efficiency report that tries to attach some reasoning behind what might be delaying a specific permit. So that would be maybe more of a question for the agency, but we were trying to look at what we could with available information that there is.
Lead Fisher.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I hear where you're coming from, that it's hard to get that information. But to me, when I'm seeing really high numbers like that, and in some of these cases where I'm seeing where it's multiple years, and knowing just from what my community and some of our surrounding communities have, where we've had companies for years who've been violating the permits, falsifying the records, they're a part of those numbers of why they're high. And that's why I get somewhat skeptical is when we're including that kind of information here, and that might be why you've got, these might be because they're bad actors out there, that's not giving me a true picture of what's really going on out there. I'm not denying that we need to be taking a look at permitting, making sure that people can get things in an efficient process. We all want that. But the thing that I'm seeing here is the way this information is provided doesn't give me that clear picture and feels like it can unfairly skew it in a way that, particularly on long time frames, it may be because of things that we don't have control over, or it's because we've got people who are, or organizations that are not doing good things. It'd be much more helpful to know that the reason it took that this one was 2 years was because they were waiting for an air permit to replace a boiler in a hospital. That kind of detail gives me a lot more information. Okay, what is going on in that instance? And I think the reason I'm bringing this up, because it goes to the bill that we're going to be seeing, is are we getting to the right problems and having the right things out there to make sure that things can process quickly without jeopardizing anything?
Thank you, Lead
you.
Fisher. And, to a couple of those points, I think that we do agree that there are bad actors, and we're all, I think, continuing to be in agreement that those permits should not be going anywhere. And what we're trying to get at, I believe in the report, is to look objectively around the country and figure out, well, what are others doing who are of similar circumstances, and why are they able to get permits to those folks requesting them in a timely way, and why can't we do that? And I think that the takeaway is there's some things that we can do, and that's what we're trying to address. Representative Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a couple questions about some of the kind of economic findings in this. There's been a lot of industry in my district of Northeast Minneapolis, thanks to President Biden and the bipartisan IIJA bill. So, for example, there is a new battery manufacturer that is opening up a shop in Northeast Minneapolis, and we're excited about that. Can you talk about some of the funding that has come out of that and how that has had an impact on jobs, and how uncertainty in having those grants cut off to our businesses here in Minnesota is affecting the way they do business?
Representative Jordan, I'm not sure that Mr. O'Neill can address the Biden administration's plans or what they might have done, but Mr. O'Neill, if you'd like to comment, you can.
Well,
go
Mr.
ahead.
Chair, we're talking about economic growth. Like, what does that have for the economic growth and the
Representative
permitting for
Jordan.
people?
Did you have
Thank
a
you,
comment?
Yeah, Mr. Chair. So just as we're talking about how these permits, so for example, I think this does relate to permits because this manufacturer in my district got a permit. They got their funding as a result of that infrastructure work. So how does unexpected changes from our federal government impact the way these permits are being handled and the economic growth for these businesses?
Mr. O'Neill.
Thank you for the question. I can't speak to how changes in federal policy would impact necessarily permitting activity here. I think what we've seen in the data is that there was an overall increase in manufacturing construction spending. That's the chart that I showed earlier in the presentation. That did align with some federal policies that were putting money into those kinds of facilities, as well as other post-pandemic economic activity that was taking place. Hard to pinpoint exact causal factors for all of those kind of aggregate trends. But what we've seen in Minnesota is that we have had continued expansion activity, but that Minnesota has been lagging other peer states in new and expansion projects. That's about as much as I can get into, I think, your question about overall investment in facilities and expansions.
Representative Jordan, follow up.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And then to the testifier, can you talk a little bit about how, unexpected natural disasters, that are often caused by climate change, which is also caused by human activity, has an impact on the business regulation, and how groups are looking for permitting and what that means if they are being impacted by things like wildfires, as we've seen in California, what impact that has on the regulatory and business environment in areas?
Mr. O'Neill.
Thank you. I don't have specific experience talking to companies about impacts from wildfires or other natural disasters and their ability to operate or expand here. Certainly that would be the case if we have a natural disaster here, we would engage the business community, but I don't have firsthand experience to share on that.
Representative Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Mr. O'Neill for your presentation here. Frankly, what Representative Fisher mentioned earlier is actually the section of the presentation that stuck out most to me as well. And I appreciate the fact that you provided detail to the committee members on the differences between average and median, because I think that median really gets to the heart of the challenges that we're facing in Minnesota, especially comparison and, just flipping to the next page, you get into talking about how we compare to neighboring states and other states across the country. Through your report, are the recommendations and the things that you talk about here, are they reflective of the measures that other states take to lower those permitting timelines? Are your recommendations in line with those?
Mr. O'Neill.
Yeah, thank you for the question. That was part of the purpose of this study, is to look at what other states do to operate similar permitting programs and see if there's anything in the design of those programs that might be leading to more efficiency. So again, I mentioned separating construction and operating permits. That's something that a lot of states have done to allow a company to begin construction and have that permit process move independently of the operating permit. That seems to be aligned with the states that have had faster permitting timelines. So that's part of what the researchers were doing, is looking at these other peer states that are issuing similar permits in a faster manner, and then looking at how their permitting programs are structured and what Minnesota can learn from that. So our recommendations reflect what we've learned from these other states.
Representative Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate your answer. And then just kind of, again, getting back to the data, the fact that, when we're looking at the median amount of days, we're talking about almost 3 years when it's 887 days here, and that's the median. That's a lot of time. Can you just confirm for the committee, and you source your information here, which I really appreciate. You cite that this is data from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. Is this fully including all of our permitting? I believe you mentioned here January 2018 through September of 23. Is that all encompassing of the publicly available data from the MPCA?
Mr. O'Neill.
Yeah, so because the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency does make public all of the different permit applications and issuances, we were able to pull 100% of those records from the MPCA's website and then be able to look at each one and the date that the application was received and the date that application or that the permit was issued. So we have a full 100% coverage of all permits within that time frame, at least as far as we're aware from the information that was available on the PCA's website.
Representative Heintzeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And following up on Lead Fisher and Representative Isaacson's, being around for a while, you get the curse of memory. And I remember House File 1 back in 2011, which was the top priority on permitting reform. And, then we passed that and we heard about it for many years after that, about how awesome it was, but apparently it wasn't, because we're back here again and again on permitting reform. And so I think the question about what is wrong, because we did major reform 15 years ago, and then I think we did some reform in 13 and 14 and 15, and we keep adjusting this, and then we do other reform. But, what you just mentioned something interesting about the time period. And so, Mr. Chair, is the time period looked at, do you have the data broken out by pre-COVID, during COVID, and post-COVID?
Mr. O'Neill.
We do, and I can go back to one of the slides that shows it broken down by year. So this slide was looking at the percentage of priority Tier 2 air permits that were issued within the state's 150-day goal by year. And you can see the range there. It was 6% in 2018, 10% in 2019, 5% in 2020 during COVID, and then after 17% and 15%. So there is some variation across years, but it didn't seem like a notable change in pre-COVID and during or post-COVID period in the time that it took the agency to issue these permits.
Representative Hanson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And then, we have a saying in environment that prevention is better than cleanup. So with a rigorous permitting process, are you seeing, compared to other states, what the compliance is on those permits? Do you see better compliance when you have a permit? Once the permit's received, is there better compliance compared to other states in terms of that permit? For example, if we're permitting pollution and there's exceedance or errors or purposeful errors, are we seeing more or less compared to other states? And then when it comes time to renew a permit, are we seeing more problems or less problems because we built in that rigorous review at the end?
Mr. O'Neill.
Thank you for the question. That was outside of the scope of this research. One of the challenges in examining state-to-state comparisons is simply being able to acquire the right data and information, especially as it relates to agency practices and your questions relating to permit violations. We just didn't have access to that data to be able to do that kind of state-to-state analysis. That would have to be conducted in additional research.
Representative Hanson, and I think that we're having a lot of good conversation around those lines, and just to add to, having a long memory, we can actually look back just a year and a few days that there was also additional changes made to permitting in Minnesota. So it does seem as though it has been an ongoing conversation that needs to be either it's being updated or improved over time, and trying to get at that. Representative Schultz, I think cut you off. Did you have anything further? I apologize.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just going to say thank you. I think that you have a very comprehensive report, and I think it tees up neatly into why we need to move forward and take up conversations surrounding how we can make this better for the people in Minnesota.
Thank you, Representative Schultz. Members, I think we're going to move forward. Thank you, Mr. O'Neill, for your testimony and presentation today. I want to let members of the audience know that we'll hear the bill and we'll hear from testifiers and then move to member questions and discussion. So I'm going to exchange positions, and Vice Chair Burkle, you're up.
All right, Chair Heintzeman, would you like to move your bill to get it before the committee?
I would move House File 8 to be recommended to be re-referred to the Labor and Workforce Development Committee.
Okay, we have the bill before us, Chair Heintzeman. I see there's an author's amendment. To get the bill in shape you want for today's discussion, would you like to offer that amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would move the A1 amendment to get the bill in the shape that I'd like for today's discussion. Members, these are technical amendments.
A2, correct? Sorry, I'm seeing A2 amendment.
The A2, sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would move the A2 to get the bill in shape I'd like for today's discussion. These are technical amendments. One, to fix a typo, change the word from type to tier, and the other to provide a little more clarity on the scoping language on page 16.
Is there any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say nay. The amendment is adopted.
All right.
All right, we have several people lined up to testify due to the number of people. Or wait, you're going to present your bill first? Sorry, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll I'll just go ahead and do a section by section breakdown of the bill. You're going to hear a number of repeating, or at least familiar language, addressing some of the things that each item addresses some of the concerns that were laid out in the previous presentation. So I'll just start in section 1 with application extensions. This reduces the number of 60-day extensions local units of government can get when it has to make determinations under the Wetland Conservation Act to 1, unless the applicant agrees to more extensions. Section 2 is on efficiency, and there's a number of bullet points under this section that I'm going to allude to. Key items are making the MPCA issue its permitting efficiency report twice per year instead of just the one time that they're currently required to comply with. With the changes that I'm making in this bill, we'd like to see what's going on in a more timely manner. I think that that could help to develop better data. We've already had some conversations about what was accessible and what wasn't. Breaking out data on permits that don't meet timeline goals. Right now, this data lumps together all applicants, but we'd like to see it broken out between municipal and industrial applications. Again, getting at some of the questions that I think that we were kind of alluding to earlier. Again, section 2, clarifying that failure of the MPCA to meet the 150-day goal for issuing a Tier 2 permit constitutes a final action, which would basically allow the applicant to seek judicial review. Requiring the MPCA to immediately inform applicants if their application isn't complete. That's been, unfortunately, something we've heard from a number of folks that are making applications for permits. So that would not let the 30-day clock reset unless the application is missing more than 30% of the required information. So that covers section 2. So section 3 would allow MPCA to issue separate permits for operation and construction. This fix would bring Minnesota in line with several other states like Colorado, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan. In our region, these states have this tiered system so that we could deal with Minnesota's weather. Back home, it was 26 below zero just 2 days ago. Obviously, that has an impact on what we can and can't be doing. So that would create some flexibility and allow those construction projects to hopefully not miss a construction cycle window and the opportunity to start building before the ground is frozen. Section 4 is on fees. This section modifies existing law that allows applicants to request and pay for expedited permitting. Again, already in law, but it's a modification. If the applicant agrees to costs and timelines with the MPCA, it would also allow the MPCA to retain the fees it charged, even if it gets the permits done ahead of schedule. That's a more carrot approach as opposed to stick. Section 5. This section would limit who could petition for an EAW, changing it from 100 people that live in the state to 100 people that live either in the county or an adjoining county where the permit is being applied for. The idea there is that we're allowing folks that are directly affected by a project to be able to comment on that and trigger another process with a petition. Section 6 is feedlot application clarification. This section clarifies that a local unit of government can begin to review a feedlot permit application that is in the environmental review process. Section 7 is creating an ombudsman for business permitting. This is something that, if you were watching the noon press conference, we discussed the fact that the governor also has proposed this in his recommendations. This would create a new ombudsman for business permitting at deed. That would be a difference between the governor's proposal and ours, but it's something that we're talking about collaboratively. Having it at deed, I would argue, puts this advocate at arm's length from the MPCA, and the mission would be to assist businesses of all sizes, but particularly small businesses, and help them getting through the bureaucracy. And it is challenging at times, and having somebody there at deed, having an advocate, could really help, I think, get people in the door and working on their permits, get them the help that they need. Section 8, scoping, EAW not required for projects that do require a mandatory EIS. So with scoping, under current law, applicants who fall into a mandatory EIS category still have to do scoping. This section eliminates that requirement, which would get rid of duplication of efforts. One more recommendation that we've connected into this legislation that would reduce time. Section 9, state implementation plan revisions. This is a technical change. The required MPCA would need to work to do, they would need, this is a technical change the MPCA would need to do to get the okay from the feds to implement Section 3 of the bill. That is related to separating operation and construction permits that we talked about earlier. Section 10. This one I very specifically wanted drafted and in the bill because, and it started, even as this bill was being discussed. I want to make perfectly clear that the intent of this legislation is not to relax any environmental standards. We all want clean air, we all want clean water, we all want clean land, and this bill does not do anything to remove those protections that are currently in statute. The issue is we're attempting to get at the process that is holding up permits and moving permits along in a more predictable and timely way. So that concludes my discussion of the bill, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Thank you for that walkthrough, Chair Heintzeman. So now we have several people lined up to testify. And due to the numbers, we're going to try and limit testimony to around 2 minutes. But given the fact that this affects MPCA the most, Mr. Johnson, we're going to give you a little more time at MPCA. So could you identify yourself for the record and proceed with your testimony?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Chair Heintzeman and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify today. For the record, my name is Tom Johnson. I'm the Government Relations Director for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. Would note I'm also representing the Environmental Quality Board today. First, want to thank the author for a productive conversation today. Looking forward to working together on the bill as it moves forward. Also want to acknowledge the Chamber Foundation for their report. Though the MPCA disagrees with some of the characterizations in the final report, it is an important snapshot, and we appreciate the discussions that we've had with the Chamber Foundation beforehand, during the development of the report, and then since the publication. Minnesotans expect the MPCA to rigorously protect our air, water, land, and climate. They also want environmental permitting and regulations that are transparent, efficient, foster economic growth, and ensure that all voices are heard during the decision-making process. So the MPCA believes any changes to the permitting process must meet all of those expectations. That being said, the MPCA believes it can do better and has been consistently reevaluating its processes. Even before this report, agency had begun internal audits and continuous improvement projects, especially in our air and water permitting programs, to identify pain points and opportunities to increase efficiency, transparency, and predictability. Among the improvements we've already started to implement, and I won't touch on them all, Mr. Chair, but one of note for the committee is a permit application tracker. Happy to share a link with the committee afterwards. We've created additional services for permittees, like an open mailbox and hotline for consultants and applicants to reach out to the agency with questions. We've started to standardize spreadsheets and templates to make it easier to submit information. And of course, we've been implementing the coordinated project plan legislation that was passed last session. These are all small things, but they do add up. But we recognize we can always improve, and the governor's budget, as Chair Heintzeman mentioned, also reflects some of the agencies and the administration's ideas for how to approach that. Also appreciate that there are ideas in House File 8 that overlap or complement the governor's budget, and we're looking forward to working together as session continues to find a path forward where everyone can see measurable improvements in the process. With that, Mr. Chair, I'm going to just hit on a couple sections here where the agency does have some concerns, mostly with how the language is written, but in mostly section 2, and then I'll just hit on a couple things in the others. But in paragraph B here, line 3.3, the additional reporting, we're hoping the permit application tracker will be a valuable real-time tool. And so we can keep the one annual report. It does take a lot of staff time to pull together that report, but we appreciate that that's a measure of accountability, and we're happy to keep that report, but maybe the permit application tracker that we've been working on, and we're happy to work together with the legislature on maybe how we can continue to improve that tool, and that can serve as a tool for permit applicants to track the progress of their permit. On paragraph D on page 4, there's some nitpicky language items, Mr. Chair, but the larger issue in the new language is what we see as a shift of the responsibility to submit a complete application, a shift from the project proposer to the agency. Currently, an application is submitted, the 90 or 150-day clock starts, and the agency determines within 30 days whether an application is administratively complete, as in they filled out all the forms, they filled out all the fields, and they have a complete application. And then we get to work on the technical review, which is the real meat and potatoes of our permitting process. This language would seem to require that we have to identify and rectify all the deficiencies of the application, not just the administrative issues, within that 30 days. And so that's going to probably have a large impact, fiscal impact. But I think we can work together on that language. Final piece on paragraph D, the line 4.13, the provision that makes the failure to meet a goal into a final decision, triggering judicial review. Mr. Chair, I'm not exactly sure what the judge would consider in this case, but what I am certain is that involvement of the courts has historically not made the process quicker or more predictable for permittees. Paragraph L, starting on page 6, line 8. The intent here seems to prioritize projects that are late, and that's understandable. But the way this is written, it would have the MPCA drop any permits being worked on to finish the permit that hasn't met the goal. So if you think of permit A is missing the goal, we have to drop permit B to work on permit A, then permit B misses the goal, and we have to drop permit C to work on permit B. And we think that will create an endless loop of essentially missing the goals and would not allow us to manage our work efficiently. Finally, of that paragraph L on 6.15 here, this, again, I would urge the committee to consider that the involvement of the courts will not result in a more timely or predictable process. Moving on to section 3, this change of moving from a combined process to a separated process, this change is possible. It would require a major rulemaking and significant resources. The way that this was set up in the past was actually designed to try and increase efficiency because we feel, I don't know the exact number, but I've heard maybe 90% of the process in the construction part of the permit is also needed to issue the operating portion of the permit long-term. Because when we think of a construction permit, we might think of it as moving dirt or laying foundations. But the construction permit in the AIR program, and this is across states, includes the full design of the facility. So we're talking about all the pollution control equipment, all of the various and sundry pieces needed to operate the facility long-term. And so most of that information would then, there would be additional permit actions that may duplicate efforts. However, if it's not clear, it's true that most of the other states in the union do separate those two permits. And so we're open to having the conversation. It is a large undertaking to do that. Section 5, I also represent the Environmental Quality Board, Mr. Chair, as I mentioned, and the EQB does have concerns with the change on lines 11.30 to 11.31. In reviewing their data, the EQB has found the great majority of petition signatures are already from individuals in the county or adjacent counties, and so the language is likely not needed. But in addition, Minnesotans may have a strong connection to an area even if they don't reside in or own property in that county or adjacent counties. Section 6, we're still reviewing this section that was added, but the MPCA and the EQB both have concerns just that this might be construed to allow like an interim permit or a temporary permit while environmental review is being completed. And just for the committee's knowledge, that is not a legal issuance. Any permit issuance does constitute a final decision. So a local unit of government, however, could work on a draft permit and public notice the draft while environmental review is being completed. But the final permit could not be issued until environmental review has been completed. So just a distinction there. We think the language as written is a little problematic, but the concept is not necessarily an issue. Section 7, the ombudsperson. I know great conversation with Chair Heintzeman earlier. Again, this is an area of shared priority. We're supportive of this concept. The agency feels there's some details to work out here on how non-public data could be shared with another agency or other considerations and logistics there if the ombudsperson is supposed to have intimate knowledge of our programs, but also reside at a different agency. There's some details to work out there, but happy to have that conversation. And then on Section 8, appreciate the amendment on the bill, Chair Heintzeman. I think that does add a lot of clarity, and the EQB does feel that some type of scoping is important for the environmental impact statement or EIS. Otherwise, there's no narrowing of the scope. It's not clear exactly what the environmental impact statement will consider. And so we do feel it's in everyone's best interest to scope the EIS. The EAW tool the environmental assessment worksheet tool already exists and is meant to inform the EIS process and includes a public process. And so those are the key pieces that we feel are needed here, scoping and a public process. And whether that's with the EAW or some other system, we're happy to work out something there. And Section 9, again, this is a technical bit. I do feel we'll spend some time in rulemaking, Mr. Chair, so quarterly reports may not be necessary, but we're open to discuss that piece. And since the final section is regarding the intent of the bill, I'll wrap up and say the Pollution Control Agency very much appreciates the intent of the legislation here. We're aligned in the shared goals of both protecting the environment and human health while fostering economic growth. And the commissioner is very much of the opinion that we can do both of those things at the same time. So thank you, Mr. Chair, for the extra time, and we're happy to stand for questions. We have a number of agency staff here as well. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I think we're going to hold questions till we get through testifiers. Next up, we'll have Tom Dicklish, Minnesota State Building and Construction Trades Council. Could you introduce yourself for the record and begin your testimony?
Thank you, Chair Heintzeman and members of the committee for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Tom Dicklich. I'm the Executive Director of the State Building and the Construction Trades Council. I'm here representing over 70,000 women and men in the building trades across the state to support this common sense improvements to the permitting process in House File 8. Minnesota is a great place to live and work. We have strong labor protections, high environmental standards, and a workforce second to none. But as we look around the country, we see major investments, especially those spurred by the Biden administration's infrastructure and manufacturing initiatives, flowing to other states, many of which don't share the high standards that we share. There's no single reason for this, but we believe uncertainty in the permitting process plays a role. Business and developers need to know that when they invest here, they won't face unnecessary delays or unpredictability. That's why we support this permitting efficiency bill. It's not about weakening protections. It's about making the process more efficient, predictable, and transparent. We're proud to stand with the business community and other stakeholders in supporting these reasonable common sense reforms. We believe they will help Minnesota compete for the next generation of jobs and investment while maintaining our strong labor and environmental standards. Thank you for your time.
Great, thank you for your testimony. Next up, we have Andrew Morley from the Minnesota Chamber. Please introduce yourself for the record and begin your testimony.
Great. Thank you, Chairman Heintzeman, Leader Fisher, and members of the committee. My name is Andrew Morley, and I work as the Environmental Policy Director for the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce, a statewide trade association representing more than 6,000 businesses across the state. Time, cost, and uncertainty in the environmental permitting process impact economic development jobs, and therefore jobs, investment, and growth in our state. When a business seeks to locate or expand, they look at a variety of factors, including taxes, energy costs, land values, workforce, and environmental permitting. Projects across sectors like agriculture, biofuels, manufacturing, and processing have chosen other states over Minnesota, including our border states, due to the length of our permitting process. And those are just what's public. It's safe to assume there are others we have not heard about. HF 8 addresses some of these concerns and is derived from a number of recommendations in the Chamber Foundation report. For example, the bill limits the wetland extensions to 60 days, requires further transparency in environmental permitting reports from agencies, separates construction and operation permits, and creates an ombudsman, all of which are examples that help streamline and find efficiencies in the permitting process and maintain protection of our environment. Several of these changes are also proposed in the governor's budget. Thank you to Rep. Heintzeman for authoring HF 8, and thank you to the governor and agencies for also pursuing reform. I look forward to continuing collaboration with all stakeholders as this bill moves through the process. I look forward to your questions at the end.
All right, thank you, Mr. Morley. Next up, we have Darren Broughton from the Minnesota Agri-Growth Council. Please introduce yourself for the record and begin your testimony.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members. My name is Darren Broughton. I'm the Executive Director of Minnesota Agri-Growth Council, a statewide coalition of Minnesota farm organizations, agribusiness, and ally groups who are committed to advancing food and agriculture in our great state. Thank you again for today and to testify in favor of House File 8. Streamlining the permitting process is a significant priority for Minnesota's ag economy. Across Minnesota, I have heard from countless businesses who have faced state permitting challenges. Nearly a dozen processing facilities in northwestern Minnesota have shared that they would like to install more efficient equipment to increase productivity and lower emissions. However, they have decided to forego that investment because the permitting process is too long and exhausting. In southern Minnesota, an agribusiness leader has identified proposed improvements at one site and an expansion at another, but struggles with our permitting process timelines. And those projects today are in limbo. The state's onerous permitting process also majorly impacts Minnesota's livestock industry. Costs and timelines associated with environmental review and permitting have resulted in few new or expanded feedlots constructed in Minnesota. In fact, Minnesota saw less than a dozen new or expanded dairies, swine, or poultry feedlots built in the last decade. Just the other day, members of the House Ag Committee heard about the challenges of Minnesota's milk processing. To build a new milk or cheese processing facility in Minnesota, a business would need to engage with 6 programs at the MPCA, which ladder up to 6 supervisors and 6 managers, 4 division directors, and 2 assistant commissioners. And this does not account for local government permits. This doesn't account for other state agencies like the DNR, DEED, and the Department of Ag. Plus, let's not forget the federal government. Yes, this process is very exhausting. Minnesota's permitting process has coordination, flexibility, and accountability challenges, not necessarily staffing ones. I want to recognize the progress that has been made. Last year, the MPCA and the legislature worked together to create a pathway for better coordination. The governor's budget this year includes a pilot program using AI to improve the permitting process and measures to hold consultants accountable during that process as well. These are all good things and that should be enacted or fully utilized. Similarly, House File 8 should also move forward as a way to streamlining our permitting process without changing any environmental standards. House File 8 will not address all of our permitting challenges. A significant one missing is the ability or the accountability and oversight of DNR. And from the ag industry, it is becoming increasingly clear that the DNR is also a significant challenge for the industry. When a farmer applies for a water appropriation permit, the DNR maintains a 180-day schedule when reviewing it and making permit decisions. However, if that application is flagged for additional review, applicants face extended time for review and stretching into 2 or 3 years without any progress towards completion. We have farmers in this state who have been waiting for 3 years to get through the first phase of a DNR water appropriation permit. Permitting reform is important across the entire state, and it also should be a priority at the DNR. And we look forward to working with you to enhance this bill or a separate reform package that addresses the DNR components. In conclusion, AgriGrowth looks forward to engaging with all of you in the coming weeks to advance and strengthen House File 8 to support Minnesota's strong agriculture and agribusiness economy. Thank you.
Thank you for that testimony, Mr. Broughton. Next up, we have Lauren Cervic from Minnesota Pork Producers Association. Please introduce yourself for the record and proceed.
Good afternoon, Chairman, Committee. My name is Lauren Cervic. I serve as the Director of Public Policy, Strategy, and Sustainability for the Minnesota Pork Producers Association, and I'm here to testify in support of House File 8. For Minnesota's more than 3,000 family pig farmers, a timely, predictable, and consistent environmental permitting and review process is paramount. The cost to permit a pig barn in Minnesota is significantly higher than in our neighboring states, according to a study done by our own Department of Agriculture. The review process can also be delayed, with administrative pauses further delaying timelines, increasing costs, and even halting projects altogether. Many decisions and commitments are made by farmers before they submit their permit, and a consistent environmental review and permit approval timeline is critical. Just like every other Minnesotan, pig farmers deeply care for our state's valuable natural resources and are committed to operating within their permits and doing the right things for their animals, the environment, and their communities. This discussion isn't about reducing thresholds or changing environmental protections. Farmers know what it takes to manage an environmentally, socially, and economically sustainable farm. And in rural Minnesota, agriculture, specifically livestock production, is a cornerstone economic engine that drives opportunities for local businesses, creates jobs, and adds vibrancy to rural communities. Pig farmers and the Minnesota Pork Producers Association look forward to engaging with legislators and the agencies to find solutions that meet the needs of Minnesota's family farmers while also creating opportunities for future generations and agribusiness owners while protecting our shared natural resources. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that testimony. Next up, we have Darren McBath from Minnesota Milk Producers Association. Please introduce yourself for the record and proceed with your testimony.
Good afternoon, Darren McBath, representing the Minnesota Milk Producers Association. Executive Director Lucas Sjostrom couldn't get off the farm today and be here, so he asked me to come. And the Minnesota Milk Producers Association appreciates the opportunity to support House File 8 and extend our gratitude to Representative Heintzeman and other co-authors for moving it forward. I'm going to address my comments today while we do support the overall bill just on Section 6. We specifically desire this section to be added to state law and support it because we're finding that many times with permit applications, keep in mind with local units of government also having their say-so in their zoning and conditional use permits, aside from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and environmental review, a permit application may be not denied, but not accepted out of hand at the local unit of government or at a county level because they know environmental review hasn't been completed yet and is pending. But there's really no reason in state law currently that they can't begin evaluating the permit or even issue a permit contingent upon the completion of other necessary permits at the state level or environmental review. And that's exactly what the permissive language only says in Section 6 on lines 1417 to 1420. And just my last point to reiterate that language is permissive. You may hear, we have talked to counties about this. They're agreeable to the direction that this is going, though you may hear they have a little concern about the other part of state law in 15.99 with the 60-day clock that local units of government face once a permit has been submitted. And they don't want to accept a permit because they're worried the 60-day clock will start to run and they wouldn't meet the deadline. Well, that's really taken care of already in state law. It's also found in the bill, it's not being amended, lines 2.8 to 210, that there's an extension of the 60-day clock if, at the local unit of government, if there's a state law, in this case there is, already requiring a process to occur before they act on their consideration. So again, I'll sum up there and say thank you for your review of permitting reform and this legislation in Section 6.
All right, thank you, Mr. McBath. Next up, we have Aaron Clems from MCEA. Please identify yourself for the record and begin your testimony.
Chair Heintzeman and members of the committee, my name is Aaron Clems. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, or MCEA. MCEA is a nonprofit public interest law firm and advocacy organization with a 50-year history of defending Minnesota's environment and the health of its people, and we appreciate the chance to testify on HF 8. We see some value in the sections of this bill that would increase reporting and data sharing with the public. The most recent permitting report produced by MPCA shows that 98% of permits are issued within a corresponding deadlines. More detailed information can only be helpful, both to this committee and to the public. But the existing data are pretty clear, that thousands of permits are completed in a timely manner and very few are not. And I'll come back to that in a minute. We're also interested in the section of the bill that establishes a permitting ombuds position. This position's duties should be broadened to include aiding the public in addressing concerns about permitted industries. As an example, just this morning, the legislative auditor issued a report that showed confusion about whether the state or the city of Minneapolis was responsible for complaints about pollution at the Smith Foundry in the East Phillips neighborhood. They reported confusion about whether the city or the state was responsible. A single point of contact would be very helpful, and we hope that will be added to the ombuds position, whether in this bill or in the governor's budget. However, MCEA imposes HF 8 as introduced. MCEA thinks it misses the point entirely. Minnesota's problem with permitting is a lack of enforcement and the inability to say no when proposals don't meet our environmental standards. It's not the lack of a deadline that drags out the permitting process, but the fact that some projects that don't meet permitting standards refuse to make changes necessary to protect the environment and comply with state laws, and then engage in political pressure to issue permits anyway. One of the most fundamental errors in HF 8 is the belief that there are yes and no decisions on permits. Instead, there is yes and not yet. The inability of agencies to say no and the refusal of industry to take no for an answer at times are the causes of many of the more intractable permitting battles that kind of inform the Chamber's report. For example, the Polymet copper nickel mine proposal. After years of political pressure on agencies to permit a reckless and dangerous copper nickel sulfide mine proposal, the Dayton administration agreed. It then worked with the Trump EPA to prevent EPA scientists from commenting on the Clean Water Act permit. Instead, these concerns were read over the phone, and MPCA employees destroyed their notes about the call, depriving the public of that information. This, among other legal errors in the permit, led a unanimous Minnesota Supreme Court to strike it down in a decision authored by a Republican-appointed justice. If there was an inspector general overseeing the MPCA, they would have a lot to talk about in this case. The inspector general of the US EPA did, of course, and published a report criticizing the EPA for its conduct. Currently, the Polymet water pollution permit, wetlands destruction permit, and permit to mine are all reversed by the courts or by agencies. But there is never a no, there is not yet. New Range, the rebranded name for Polymet, is pursuing reissuance of all of these permits. The reason why I talk about this example is because the problem here cannot be fixed by streamlining or permitting reform. Real permitting reform would center communities that are affected by pollution, not the polluters. Real permitting reform would ensure public participation, not limit it as HF 8 would. Permitting reform cannot be a permission slip to pollute, but in this current form, that's what HF 8 would be. One last word. There's no safety net here. Courageous public employees at the US EPA made sure that their concerns about the Polymet permits were heard through their union in 2019. But the news out of Washington, D.C. in 2025 makes it clear that it's up to us, the state of Minnesota, to defend our environment and the health of all the people of Minnesota. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
All right, thank you, Mr. Clems. Next up, we have Andy Wilkie from the Greater Mankato Growth. Please introduce yourself for the record and begin your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Andy Wilkie. I serve as the Executive Vice President of Greater Mankato Growth, the Regional Chamber of Commerce and Economic Development organization, serving more than 900 members, including private businesses, cities, schools, colleges, universities, nonprofits, and our local school district. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Greater Mankato is a vibrant and growing Greater Minnesota metro hub with a large trade area. We attract a workforce from an area that includes more than 22 counties in southern Minnesota and northern Iowa. We have the highest rates of retail spending per capita and more than any other Minnesota metro that includes more than 25,000 college students. And agriculture is at the core of our economy. We are at the center of the green seam. More soybeans are processed in Mankato than any other city in North America. To the proposal before us, a key policy priorities for the members of Greater Mankato Growth is to improve the regulatory environment in Minnesota. Excessive regulation constrains economic growth of our state. We support reforms that streamline regulations while maintaining appropriate regulations necessary to keep workers, consumers, and our environment healthy. House File 8 achieves many of the key objectives critical to the permitting process, such as early notification to applicants if their application is missing any information, and does not push an application to the bottom of the list when a minor supplemental information is requested. Additionally, the bill establishes a go-to professional, independent within the agency, to help guide applicants through the complicated permitting process. Further, this professional would provide individual analysis of all aspects of the permitting process and provide recommendations to agencies. In Greater Minnesota, we understand the critical need to be a strong, active partner with business, large and small, who want to invest their dollars in our state. However, unnecessary burdens, barriers, and costs not only gets in the way of investment opportunities, it sends a message that investing here is difficult, maybe even unwelcome. Unfortunately, this is the reputation created in Minnesota. Site selectors and real estate professionals across Minnesota and the nation oftentimes don't even consider Minnesota for new facility investments. The common denominator is time and uncertainty. For example, a simple one-for-one equipment replacement at a manufacturer in Mankato took more than a year to approve. Greater Mankato Growth members are committed to protecting the natural resources of our state, but improved balance and accountability must be achieved to ensure our state is economically competitive and is a great place to work, live, and do business. We urge you to support House File 8.
All right, next up, we have Don Georgia, Sierra Club. Please introduce yourself for the record and begin your testimony.
I'm Dawn Georgieff. I'm here basically just as a Minnesota citizen. And I'd like to represent those of us who are avid users of our waterways, boaters, fishermen, et cetera. And my concern with HF 8 is Section 5, which is the area about the who's able to bring a petition for an environmental review. And the way it has previously been set up is that 100 Minnesota citizens are able to do that. With this bill, it's suggested that, as was stated before, that it would be the people in the county or contiguous counties. Many of us are in the Twin Cities area, and we use non-contiguous counties for our recreation. We are dependent upon the quality of those waterways. There would be times when there would be a need for an environmental review. We would have our voice taken away from us with this bill. The Minnesota waterways belong to all Minnesotans, not just the people that are downstream from these projects. So I would please at least ask you to, in speaking for those of us who are boaters and fisher people, we need these waterways clean, and there are going to be times when there's going to be need for an environmental review, and we want to have a voice in that. Thank you.
All right, thank you for your testimony. Next up, we have Rob Sipp from Red River Watershed Management Board. Could you introduce yourself for the committee and
Thank
proceed?
you, Mr. Chair. My name is Robert Sipp. I'm the Executive Director of the Red River Watershed Management Board, and we're a joint powers board of 7 watershed districts up in the Red River Valley. So today my comments will focus a little bit more on the watershed world. I also want to thank on behalf of my board, Chair Heintzeman and the other authors, and also the Chamber of Commerce for working on this important issue. So up in the Red River Valley, we have 10 projects within our funding process right now. And those 10 projects required 89 permits, and that's from local, state, and federal agencies. However, 62% of those permits were from state agencies, including DNR, PCA, and then also Bowser. So 89 permits, and then we also have another 15 projects at the very concept initial phase. And we know that not all those projects may go to the end where they would be constructed, but if the average number of permits per project is 9, we're looking at about 135 additional permits in the future here. And so right now with all these projects that we're working on, the 89 permits, that's to the tune of about $5 million in permitting fees and environmental review costs borne by our local watershed districts. And that ultimately comes out of local taxpayer dollars. So just a couple quick examples, some other concerns. We would like to see some additional coordination between state agencies and the federal government. And sometimes what happens is we'll have a joint project with the watershed district and the DNR, and it might be on state land. And if that land was purchased years ago with federal funds, well, then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service needs to come in to do some additional review. And that causes more time and effort and then additional cost. And then there are also times when we have school trust lands involved and then the Land Exchange Board becomes involved. And then that again causes considerable time delays. Something else that we see is that the agencies have differing processes and procedures. And that just adds to the level of complexity and the amount of time to do permitting and to get everything through environmental review processes. So just two quick example projects. We do have one project up in the Middle Snake Tamarack River Watershed District up by Warren, Minnesota. That project was moving forward, and at the 11th hour, a rare wetland was found. And the watershed spent about $800,000 on permitting and environmental review. That project is effectively halted. It will not move forward, and $800,000 in local dollars and also some federal dollars was lost. We also have another large project up in Representative Burkle's area. It's called the Klondike Clean Water Retention Project. That's being moved forward by the Two Rivers Watershed District. And with that project, they have a real large fen wetland, about 18,000 acres. Actually took 1 year to develop the management plan for that and 3 years for an operating plan with multiple agencies and multiple divisions within agencies involved. So from our perspective, Red River Valley, Northwest Minnesota, what is needed, we'd like to see, again, higher levels of coordination between state and federal agencies, and then potentially some greater recognition and acceptance of regional processes in lieu of state permitting. And I don't have time to get in this today into too much detail, but up in the Red River Valley, we do have a mediation agreement from 1998, which involves agencies, environmental groups, the Red Board, and others regarding how we develop flood projects and water storage projects. So with that, I thank you for the opportunity to comment and look forward to working with the author.
All right, thank you, Mr. Sipp, for your testimony. Next up, we have Brian Werner from Minnesota Biofuels Association.
Chair Heintzeman and members of the committee, my name is Brian Werner, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Minnesota Biofuels Association, which represents ethanol producers across our state. Minnesota's renewable fuel sector helps support farmers, rural communities, and our state's economy and environment through the production of low-carbon transportation fuel and animal feed from Minnesota-grown feedstocks. MBA members want to do even more to contribute to the state's economic and environmental goals, but lengthy delays in obtaining permits to build, expand, and operate their facilities have hampered these efforts. We support HF8 to make the permitting process more efficient, and I also want to specifically highlight some things this bill doesn't do. It doesn't change or loosen permit standards. All permittees will be held to the exact same Clean Air Act rules as before. It doesn't weaken enforcement. MPCA will have the same ability to go after bad actors and fine them or shut them down. What this bill does is move our state's environmental permitting process in a more efficient, certain, and timely direction. It will allow ethanol plants to achieve better environmental outcomes by helping them more quickly adopt the latest technologies and production processes that lower carbon intensity scores and improve energy efficiency, while unlocking a path towards new market opportunities like sustainable aviation fuel. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
All right, thank you. Next up, we have Veda Kanitz from DFL Environmental Caucus Legislative Committee. Please identify yourself for the committee and begin your testimony.
Thank you, Chair Heintzeman and members of the committee. My name is Veda Kanitz, and I'm here on behalf of the DFL Environmental Caucus. Since 2015, our mission has been to educate and mobilize the citizens of Minnesota to address the climate crisis and to protect, preserve, and restore the natural environment. Minnesota is blessed with a natural heritage that gives us a quality of life second to none. But that quality of life is threatened by this bill. House File 8 should be named the Permit to Pollute Bill. It creates unnecessary and dangerous shortcuts to a thoughtful permitting process and may do irreparable harm to our natural resources, ecosystems, property value, and tourism industry. It will trample tribal rights and saddle our children with a mess they did not make. Minnesota tourism alone is a $24 billion industry, mining only $4 billion. Tourism creates over 180,000 jobs, mining around 11,600. The bill threatens tourism in favor of extractive industries. So why the short timeline? Permitting decisions do usually meet deadlines, and when they don't, it's likely due to problems with the permit itself. One example already pointed out was the Polymet Northmet mine, where efforts to push through permits led to poor decisions. The state must not take shortcuts when protecting us from dangerous sulfide ore pollution. State-issued permits to mine, water permits, and dam safety permits were all ultimately redacted because our state agencies failed to protect us. This bill will not improve permitting. It will make it easier for industries to pollute and even more difficult for our state agencies to do their due diligence to protect our way of life, our beautiful natural heritage, and to honor our treaties. Thank you for listening.
All right, thank you. Next up, we have Brian Martinson from the Association of Minnesota Counties. Please identify yourself and begin your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. My name is Brian Martinson. I'm the Environment Policy Analyst with the Association of Minnesota Counties, a membership organization representing all 87 Minnesota counties. We are interested in permit reform, and for the purposes today, I'm going to keep my comments to just two sections of the bill that impact local decision-making. First, Section 1 of the bill limits extensions of MS 1599 agency deadlines to act on an application. I'm going to refer back to the Chamber report, and on page 19, I quote, "Minnesota typically processes wetland applications in a timely manner." The report goes on to say, there does not appear to be a limit on how many times an LGU can extend decision timelines. I would contend that that's a misunderstanding of the law. It goes on to note several times that there was no data available to substantiate a concern of continuous extensions under wetland decision-making in 1599. Reading the statute, legal guidance, consultation with other entities subject to 1599, and how the law is applied, LGUs are limited to one extension before the end of the initial 60-day period of up to 60 days, and anything beyond that requires the applicant's approval. If there's a feeling that this needs to be clarified in the law, it should be done generally and not only for the WAC decisions causing confusion in the statute. Section 3 amends the law 116D.4 subdivision 2.04 subdivision 2 that prevents a final decision on projects subject to environmental review until the environmental review is complete, by adding that local governments may review or do a preliminary decision on or approval of a feedlot permit. The current law does not appear to prevent preliminary review from happening before an EPA environmental review is complete, only the final decision. I will not contest that 1599 does not apply because of the statute cited by a previous testimony. This law seems intent to clarify the ability to do this simultaneous review. The only question I have is at this time is whether adding language specific to feedlots will restrict the ability to do simultaneous review on other permits that would fall under this section. While both sections 1 and 3 seem well-intentioned, but don't advance the issues with the rest of the bill, the case in section 1 seems to add confusion to it. Counties are interested in working on permit reform, and we would be happy to support language that improves efficiency and regulatory certainty. Thank you.
All right, thank you for your testimony. Is there anyone in the audience that wishes to testify on House File 8? If not, we will, oh wait, we do have one. Yep. Please identify yourself for the committee and proceed with your testimony.
Mr. Chairman, committee members, my name is Tim Kelly. I'm the administrator of the Coon Creek Watershed District. Coon Creek is the second oldest watershed district in the state. It exists on the north side of the metropolitan area. And the metropolitan service area line runs through the middle of the district, and it has for a very, very long time. So we are half rural, we are half urban. We also include the cities of Blaine and Coon Rapids that have been some of the fastest growing communities in the state. We also exist in a landscape that has very high groundwater levels. And for Anoka County, 47% of the threatened and endangered species in the state are found within Anoka County. So it is a crucible and a crossroads for all of the issues that's being talked about. The Watershed District Board has committed itself to pursuing the state statutes. We have several impaired waters, and we have been very successful in gaining and using beneficially the monies that the legislature has set aside with really great success. Our restoration of Middle Sand Creek has received national attention, and our use of iron-enhanced sand filters and other water quality devices has achieved worldwide attention. What I'm here to talk about are three sections of House File 8. One is, I would hope that the committee and that the author would consider including a similar amendment to Minnesota Statute 84.027, which does in fact address the Department of Natural Resources. The other, to leverage this, we applaud the author for not addressing water quality standards. But the other is that there seems to be an issue statewide where restoration projects are getting caught up in a sudden change with both agencies that is costing timelines. For the district, for our construction, most recently the restoration of Lower Sand Creek, our construction window was about 5 weeks in December. And it was caught in a couple of last minute, if you have small children, it's, oh, by the way, you need 401 certification. Oh yeah, and by the way, you need to go through additional threatened and wildlife review. In those cases, there was no certain finding, there was a concern. So the other two amendments that we're hoping that the board, that the legislature will address go to two things relative to efficiency. One is that the agencies have clear findings of a complete application. There was testimony earlier on the administrative procedures from the Pollution Control Agency. I've been dealing with regulations for most of my career, and I deal with 7 cities and have dealt with numerous cities, and that is a fundamental step. The administrative completeness versus the standards are two different steps, and they don't seem to be very clear within the agencies.
Could you wrap up testimony soon here? We want to get to member questions as soon as we can.
The second question is that in your report that you're asking for, the statistic that you're missing are the number of permits that are incomplete. There is concern within the watershed districts and other permittees, the counties as well as soil and water districts, of basically a pocket veto. And consequently, those projects sit and applicants never hear back, or it's an extended period of time. If you're in the midst of construction and you've spent 2 years lining up the permits, working with the citizens, working with property owners, working with the agencies, last-minute delays are a project killer. And unfortunately, in our case, those projects are restoration projects. So I'll keep it short, Mr. Chairman. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
All right, thank you. Thank you for your testimony. Is there anyone else? Otherwise, we're going to go to member questions and try and move things along. All right, members, if you have any questions, can we start? Representative Purcell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a few questions for the bill author and a few questions for the MPCA. Perhaps I could start with the MPCA. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So my question to the agency, so a couple of things about the permitting process. So we talked about the duplicative nature and trying to streamline this process in this bill. But then we heard about a permit for construction versus a permit for operation. What is the current process that, I guess we don't have this process yet. What have you seen in other states, and what could be the process if one of those was approved and one of those denied? And then I have a follow-up. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, for the record, Tom Johnson, serve as the Government Relations Director for the MPCA. Mr. Chair and Representative Purcell, the process in other states, as far as I understand it, and if we get much beyond this point, I'll have to phone a friend, but the process as I understand it is an applicant would apply for the construction permit itself, go through the process that is largely the same as the process that we have currently for the combined permit, except there would likely be some quicker timelines. There might be some information that is not needed just for the construction portion, but the applicant would likely be able to, in some basis, be able to operate under that construction permit for for some period of time as the operation permit is being completed. So it gets into some complexity, but essentially, as I said, the construction permit itself is a large permit. It goes through all of the pieces of the facility. I'm not sure exactly what would happen if one permit was denied and one permit was granted, but I assume the facility would not be able to operate in that regard, in that instance.
Representative Purcell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And a follow-up, I believe it was in your testimony, Mr. Johnson, that you said that rulemaking would take significant resources. So I'm wondering how many FTEs if this were shifted, and then I'm going to ask about a fiscal note for the bill author here as well.
All right, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I don't have the draft fiscal note in front of me. We have submitted that, and I'll let the author answer that piece of the question if we've seen it on their side. But my understanding is it would be considered a very large rulemaking, similar to the type of rulemaking that we're undertaking for some of the changes in 2023 for cumulative impacts or air toxics. It's a tremendous effort, and so would likely be in that same type of category.
All right, Representative Purcell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So because we passed those, I presume those had fiscal notes. So I wondered from the author if we have a fiscal note. I don't have one in front of me. Thank you.
Representative Heintzeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Purcell. We requested a fiscal note early on in this process. I'm told that it is either very close or there's pieces of it that some folks have been able to see, but I have not yet been given one.
Can you,
Mr. Chair, there is a fiscal note requested on this bill as well as the Senate file for comparable bill. It's a consolidated fiscal note. So there's multiple agencies on it. PCA, I believe, has completed their portion, and the budget office has signed off on it. It's missing a different agency. That's why it's not a completed fiscal note at this point. If PCA wants to talk to their pieces, they certainly can.
Thank you, Mr. Hagemeyer. Representative Purcell, are you done?
Thank you. My final question.
Sure.
Mr. Chair. So I'm wondering to the bill author, I heard so many suggestions. I maybe heard a suggestion that we need a Department of Water so that we don't have 6 different state departments that deal with water permits. I heard talking about redundancy, and I'm just wondering if you will be taking any of these suggestions into account as you go on, and if you intend to work with the testifiers or the different agencies going forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Heintzeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Representative Purcell, I am going to be working with as many stakeholders as want to be a part of the process as best we can. I do think that there is broad support for what we have here. And as we can find ways to bring stakeholders together from all sectors and then work with MPCA, the intent is to absolutely do that.
All right, Representative Falconer.
All right, thank you. Following up on my earlier freshman moment of asking at the wrong time, but I just wanted to ask, would this bill allow for the expediting of mining permits, the taconite, sulfate, or copper mining, or any other?
Representative Heintzeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Representative Falconer. So what we're trying to do here is address primarily the small business and medium businesses that we're hearing the most from. That's what we're working towards. That's where the most need is. And I think that we've got a pretty good starting point to get at that. Now, that being said, there was a whole lot of folks at the press conference that I mentioned earlier from all sectors. I think there's broad support and interest in this. And as I had also mentioned earlier, there was a lot of conversation this last session about what are we doing in one sector, and there was permitting reform that was passed, and we're working to try to make sure that everyone has a bite of the apple and is able to see some benefit from that. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. So that's my target with the legislation that's been proposed, is the small to medium-sized businesses, but I suppose everybody could benefit.
Representative Falconer, follow-up.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to clarify, so yes, this would allow for the expediting of mining permits.
Representative Heintzeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Falconer. Yeah, that's possible.
Right.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
I was asking for clarification just on a specific yes or no, that this would affect the timeline of mining permits, potentially to expedite the process for them.
Representative Heintzeman.
Mr. Chair, that's unclear.
Representative Jordan.
Okay.
Representative Falconer, are you done? Do you have a follow-up again?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Go ahead.
No, well, so I listened in for the press conference that you had at noon with Senator Hochschild. And so just perhaps a comment, maybe you can provide some clarification, but Senator Hochschild was specifically quoted, I know that you were there, so you can attest to this, that this is not about one industry or type of business. This is about across the board making this process easier. A little bit later on, he went to say, behind us, we have stakeholders from agriculture, labor, from mining, and all sorts of industries and businesses, obviously with the chamber, showing that we have a broad coalition just trying to make it so that our process is easier for all types of businesses. So I'm just wondering if you stand by that, which would seem to be a yes, not a I don't know, on whether or not this could impact the timeline of mining.
Representative Heintzeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Representative Falconer, for the clarification, the opportunity to readdress that. The intent is not to target any one industry.
Representative Falconer.
Okay. Unless you say otherwise, I'll take that as a yes, that this would
Chair Heintzeman.
that this would impact the timelines for mining operations in Minnesota.
Representative Heintzeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Falconer, the intent is not to benefit any one industry.
All right.
Okay. Just closing comment. I just, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
I just think we're just watching live as the Trump administration is dismantling and gutting environmental protections. We also have congressional legislation canceling protections for the boundary waters, going so far as to disallow judicial challenge to permits, even if glaring omissions, such as in the case of an expedited federal process, leads to inadequate review before permits were granted, which it sounds like, to me, this has the potential for that same scenario to play out here. Additionally, the EPA staff are being told to pack up and go, other executive orders on cutting environmental processes. And to be honest, this feels like a bill carrying out Project 2025's only mention of Minnesota's only mention, fast-tracking massive sulfide or toxic mining next to the boundary waters that pollute two of our national treasures, boundary waters and Voyageurs National Park. I mean, Minnesota is so valued our natural resources that we raise our own taxes to protect them and to conserve them. And I think people are very much concerned what this bill's ramifications would be for the potential for sulfide or copper mining in very sensitive places, such as the watershed of the boundary waters. And I'll just end my comment there. I just can't get behind this bill just with that impact in it alone. Like I understand the need for smaller businesses, but there are no mom and pop mining shops that we're concerned about here. This one in particular, this international mining corporations with no vested interest in our public lands would see the ability to fast track their plans with limited public review, the ability to request EAWs. This just goes against the ethos and the way of life Minnesotans have come to appreciate as far as conserving and protecting our natural lands.
Representative Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And to Representative Falconer's point, there's a letter in my packet from Mining Minnesota that does say that this bill impacts their permitting process. So I think the mining industry sees that this bill is a mining bill, so that feels like a pretty solid answer to me. The other thing I have, just as another follow-up to another member's questioning, is what Representative Purcell had questions about the fiscal note process, and I mean, it's good that there's a fiscal note being started. So, Mr. Chair, is there an intent to bring this bill back so that we are the fiscal committee that examines the fiscal impacts on the MPCA? Is this bill going to come back so we can further examine those fiscal impacts on the MPCA?
Chair Heintzeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Representative Jordan. To your first point, again, there's no one industry that is being targeted in this bill. So if maybe you're a builder would say this is something that's targeted for them. But what it is intended to do is to make sure that we're not going out of our way, not attempting to target anything at any one trade, organization, or business. To your second question, that is yet to be determined.
Representative Jordan.
Mr. Chair, thank you. That's our job. We're the fiscal committee that looks at the fiscal impacts on this. So I would request that this bill does come back so we can examine that. It seems like it needs to. I think that's our job. I don't think it's good for us to shirk our duties of examining the fiscal impacts on our government, which is like literally why we're sitting here. So it needs to come back, and I hope we will see it back so we can look at it with a completed fiscal note. We heard testimony from the DNR that said that public land is land that belongs to all Minnesotans. So does your bill have impacts on projects that are proposed on public land?
Representative Heintzeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not aware of all the projects in the entire state. I'm not aware of what specifically you're looking for in your question, so I apologize if I am not going to have a specific answer for you.
Representative Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, Representative Heintzeman, does your bill apply to projects that are proposed on public land? So if I was proposing a project on public land, say a logging operation, would this bill pertain to that operation and permitting of it?
Representative Heintzeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the question, Representative Joy, I really do. I am familiar with logging projects and other operations going on around the state. If you're asking me about a specific project, I'm not aware of a specific project. Is there an impact that potentially a permit could have? That's possible.
Representative Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, just generally, does this law apply to projects that are proposed on public lands? I'm also not referencing any particular project. I'm just asking in general, does this apply to projects on public land?
Representative Heintzeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Jordan. All projects applied. None are singled out.
Representative Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this does apply to projects that are on public land. And in that case, and since the DNR testified in our committee the other day that the public owns those public lands, why does your bill then seek to input and limit the ability of the public to comment on land that pertains to them? I mean, you said here that we're talking about the people that are most impacted. If this land belongs to people, why are you limiting their ability to comment on that land that belongs to them?
Representative Heintzeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for the question, Representative Jordan. So you're probably aware of, in reference to the specific section that we're addressing that issue, that there was a time when the process didn't even require that it was people from Minnesota. And there were folks that were adjoining Minnesota that felt that they should have input into permitting in Minnesota. And it's the same argument. In this case, the bill would limit those petitioners to the county where the project is occurring and adjoining counties. And I can point you to a number of examples offline if you'd like to have a conversation. I could give you the data. I don't have it right in front of me, the examples that I have brought to me, where there's petitioners coming from distant corners of the state. And what we're trying to do is make sure that if there is a issue that needs to be addressed, it's those that are in that county or an adjoining county. Now, there's probably an alternative to the language that I have here that maybe is more agreeable to some folks, but I think that it makes sense as a starting point to have that included, and that's why I have it here in the language today.
Representative Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this is a problem. You know, I'm here representing the voice of the people of Northeast Minneapolis and Southeast Como, and 50% of my constituents are renters. A number of us also don't own land. We might own a condo, such as I do. And so public land is the only land that we own. This is the only area where we can hunt or gather, mushrooms or herbs or berries or something. It's where we can go hiking. The other thing that matters is, our water comes from the Mississippi River. There are projects that are above stream and not in an adjoining county where we've had issues where there has been nuclear waste that has been leaked into the Mississippi River. There is PFAS upriver that has affected my water that I drink and that millions of Minnesotans drink. And this bill would limit their ability to comment on their drinking water, on the air they breathe. That doesn't, air doesn't care about your county lines. It doesn't care about what this is. This patchwork is not a good idea. It's not worth, it's absurd. We're talking about land that is owned by the people of Minnesota, by all of our constituents that we're here to speak for. And it feels very upsetting to hear that we feel like they should not have a voice in their land, their water that they drink, and the air that they breathe. I'm not going to ask a question about this, but I do think this bill absolutely needs to come back. The bill author himself has said that he doesn't have all the information about the bill that is before us. We don't have a fiscal note, so it needs to come back. I will be bringing it back to the Rules Committee on which I serve if it doesn't. This is a problem. The other thing, I don't know if we have time, but we also need to discuss, it hasn't been brought up yet, the separation of the construction permits versus the operating permits. And I think our testifier who was talking about the Red River Valley brought it up. Because as the bill author stated, the intent of this bill is not to relax environmental standards. I heard the bill author state that legislative intent very clearly, and if he needs to restate that or clarify, that's fine too. But that would mean that rare wetland that person brought up would still be there. So that business owner would receive their building permits, and then there would be a rare wetland discovered, but they would not be offered that permit to actually conduct that business if it had an impact on it. So I'm wondering about what this separation of permits means for those business owners and for residents if there's going to have an impact on the business, and what that means for someone who is building a business or building a site of something, that construction permit without the operating permits. Is that person just out money? Are we just going to feel really bad for them and let them destroy that rare wetland or whatever anyway? I'm just really kind of unclear about how that works, and I don't know if there's any other it sounds like there are other states that do this, but there just seems like there's a lot of information that's missing here. And I'm just kind of curious about how that would all work out. So thank you, Mr. Chair, and that's my last question.
Okay, we have Representative Finke on the list here, but lead and Hansen too. Let's go with Representative Finke. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, and Chair, for your bill. I just have one question. It's come from listening to the conversation and what you've been saying about how no one industry is really being set to succeed more than anything else in this bill, right? And you said that the small and medium-sized businesses are your intention. That's the behind the center of this bill, and I fully believe that that is true. I have no reason not to, but it does make me wonder if we have small and medium-sized businesses that we're looking to service, but then we also have large multinational mining corporations that are looking to come in and mine our sensitive natural landscapes. And then we have construction permits, and then we have, industrial mega corporate agricultural livestock and farms. Why are we trying to have them all follow the same policy, right? Just very simply speaking, should we have one process for all of those industries? Those industries are vastly different, and the downstream effects of all of those are vastly different. Maybe we shouldn't be doing one thing and saying no industry should benefit from this. Maybe we should be saying each of these industries needs their own attention. So I'm just curious if that's something is that just like sort of an obvious thing that we're missing here? Thank you.
Representative Heintzeman, do you want to address that? Or?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Finke. I'd be happy to work with you on that. That sounds like a theme as we're visiting about the impacts of this bill. And there may be some misunderstanding as to what the bill does and doesn't do. It feels as though we've covered that ground, but there is maybe more conversations to be had, and I'd be happy to have those conversations.
Representative Finke, do you follow up? So given, in fact, it's 3 o'clock here, should we just, I'm curious, Lead Fisher, would you like to? We'd like to come back. Let's come back at 4 o'clock. I think we'll recess until 4. We're in room 120, remember? So with that, we'll be in recess.